One step is all it takes in your Renaissance cubensis magic mushroom farm from Hidden Creek. Hidden Creek magic mushroom farms are easier, faster, and far more productive than any of the mushroom growing kits on the market today. And best of all, success is guaranteed. Psi Energy, a natural path to a new experience from Hidden Creek. The magic mushroom people who are forever keeping your mind in mind.
That was an ad for Hidden Creek mushrooms from a 1980 edition of High Times magazine.
Psi Energy, baby.
Yeah, do you feel convinced, Camille?
I'm very susceptible to advertising.
Yeah.
But I will say that was an especially convincing pitch, and I'm sold.
Consider me influenced.
I'll mail my address and some cash to the P.O. box and get things going. Welcome to Texas Overture, guys.
Yeah, hi. Good to be back. I'm Faith.
I'm Camille. It's been a minute. We're back in the studio.
Yeah, today's going to be a fun, beautiful journey.
Yeah, a psychedelic. It's going to be a trip. Let's say that. It's going to be a real trip.
Right.
Today, we're going to examine the strange case of Dr. Stephen Pollock, a pioneering figure in the world of mycology who met an early death at the age of 33 under shadowy and divisive circumstances at his home on Springbrook Road in San Antonio. This is a story that involves magic mushrooms, the combustible social atmosphere of Texas in the late 70s, illegal drug operations, scrubbed records, and a man driven to drive his vision to a successful end no matter the means. At once a local Dr. Feelgood to junkies and politicians alike, and a determined researcher desperate to break his findings into mainstream medicine. This duality ultimately led to the slaying of the SA Shroom King, Dr. Stephen Pollock.
The fatal follies of Dr. Feelgood.
Damn.
So our subject for today, Stephen Hayden Pollock, was born in Los Angeles in 1947. He ended up going to Wisconsin to go to the Medical College of Wisconsin. He graduated from there in 1975, and then he eventually went on to do pharmacology studies. He got a job at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio.
Yeah, and during this time, he became increasingly interested in mycology, the potential of mushrooms in the medical field, and he kind of, as a pet project, independently began doing research. He was traveling to different locations all over the world, building relationships with other people in the field. He published a few articles in various journals, and began developing a method of growing psilocybin mushrooms. And so in 1977 he published a book called Magic Mushroom Cultivation, which was one of the first of its kind after the Terence McKenna book. I don't remember what that's called, but it was only like a year after that or something.
And the things that he was writing about, I mean, they were revelations for the mushroom community. He was writing about things that people had not heard of before, like using Purina dog chow and brown rice as growth substrates, because they produced offspring that had incredibly high psilocybin contents.
Yeah, and while the book kind of detailed like these different methods, only later did like chemical analysts kind of decide, wow, this guy, like he figured it out. Brown rice is the way to go.
Yeah.
So that was pretty significant in the timeline of his life.
Yeah, and it kind of grew his... people definitely thought that he was strange, but they knew that he was strange to an ends that was usable for them.
Yeah, he was like a kind of classic mad scientist, if you will, in the mushroom community. now find ourselves in the swampy paradise that is Tampa, Florida, at the second iteration of the International Mycological Conference.
Right, and this is 1977, just right after Pollock's book came out, Magic Mushroom Cultivation.
And he, well, you know, scholars and novel enthusiasts are passing in and out of the doors of the convention center. Pollock is parked in the parking lot, operating out of his Winnebago, Walter White style.
Yeah, sifting through mushrooms in the parking lot. People are sort of looking at him.
Who's this bearded freak?
They're used to a more covert operation than what Pollock has going on.
But there were still nonetheless interested parties who wandered over to those double doors to see what was up.
Yeah, there were a lot of famous mycologists at this conference. Gary Linkoff, Gaston Guzman. Gary Linkoff and Pollock were both very interested in Gaston Guzman. And when Linkoff eventually approached Pollock in the parking lot, they both simultaneously decided that Guzman's research he was presenting was less interesting than all of the possibilities surrounding them in Tampa at that particular moment.
Yeah.
And what a blessing that they did.
Because their mutual understanding and instinct to kind of scavenge and survey the land led to a very very special discovery.
Right, and the culture of mycology and mushroom hunting in the late 70s was that of interest, curiosity, intense suspicion. A lot of people would go to farms without consent of the farmers after it had rained,
which
or
is
something.
like, you should never trespass on a rule. Like, that's like a fundamental of life. Never enter a farmer's pasture without farmer's consent.
That's true. I do feel like down here in Texas things are different.
We know what could happen.
Yeah, but Florida is a lawless land. And I mean, there were a lot of cases where people would wander onto a farmer's pasture and get beaten to death,
shot.
Yeah, but there were also cases where the farmers would see it as a money-making opportunity and allow people to enter. They could buy a pass and mushroom hunt, and from then it was out of the farmer's hands.
Manure is it's like gold.
Yeah, also
to some.
Growth substrate.
Yeah.
So they use their pull as mycologists attending town for the conference specifically to gain access to.
They flashed some badges.
Cow pasture.
And even though they had, at least Pollock had the look of a red flag hippie stock that kind of frightened the more territorial of farmers. They were granted admittance.
One version of the story apparently goes that they're walking through the field. Pollock accidentally drops his doobie.
Bro. Oh, hell. Yeah.
And it lands in the shadow of a beautiful mushroom with a caramel cap, a thin stem. But I think probably the more real version goes that he just looked down and he saw it.
And he identified the kind of purple-hued gills, which is usually indicative of a high psilocybin content.
Right, so, Linkoff, Pollock, these men were stoked. They pick the mushroom. I think it says that he slices it open lengthwise, puts it in a petri dish. Eventually things start growing in the mycelium that are totally unheard of. Eventually he eats it, and he has a beautiful psychedelic journey that I guess the idea is that it was more intense than he had experienced, or it was in some way much different or more vivid.
He ultimately would refer to the strain as the Philosopher's Stone to emphasize the discovery. And I believe scientific name is Psilocybe tampensis.
Tampanensis.
Okay.
Like,
I have
you know,
chicken scratch handwriting.
the city
that I.
Tampa.
Damn. Okay.
So Psilocybe tampanensis was important to Pollock, not only because he's a mycologist and he had been searching for new species, but because his goal was to create a $2 million super lab to grow and research mushrooms in. And so this new discovery of his and his ability to sort of selectively breed it and make it, available, the philosopher's stones, as he would call them, this could very well be his ticket to getting the lab that he wanted.
Yeah, so quickly kind of capitalizing on the momentum that he saw, the potential he saw in the lavender gills of this Floridian mushroom, he joined forces with a man named Michael Forbes, and they created the brand Hidden Creek, the very one that we read the advert from in High Times. And things are moving really fast at this point. They brand the shroom as Cosmic Camote, or the Philosopher's Stone. They put the ad in High Times, and very quickly, it's distributed all over the world, and they become the largest mushroom distributor in the world.
Right. I'm not familiar with High Times aside from this, but I guess it's like, the number one stoner mag for...
You guess it's extremely epic and totally cool?
Yeah, and I mean, through his association with High Times, he, as you said, became the largest home delivery service in the entire world.
I looked through a couple old High Times, and it was like a very fun magazine. It made me really appreciate the magazine industry and all the work that went into providing people with wacky little snapshots and asides. There's some good interviews. There was like a glamorous Cheech and Chong cover shoot, but they also had like interviews with like writers, and it was like there were some highbrow pieces.
It had some beautiful art, some like nice Planet K style blue light,
Faith has talked about wanting to become a Planet K artist.
I would love to do like large scale drawings of gnomes smoking pipes and stuff, or like dragons and wizards.
Stephen Pollock presiding over his grow
and Pickle
lab.
Rick
dapping each other up or something. That would be awesome. If anybody has a connect, Faith's really talented. So truly, like in the span of like a couple years, he's quickly raking in like God, how much was he making every month? It was like
$10,000.
It was something absurd.
Wait, no, that's not
It was
true
like
at all.
$50,000.
Yeah, $10,000 was a different number. I wrote down.
Let's verify that actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was $50,000. And so things are moving very quickly, and it's from the time of the discovery of the strain to it being the ads being placed in High Times, and these are usually ads with like seductive women, of course. Hidden Creek was quickly raking in about $50,000 a month, but it wasn't enough, and Pollock had a growth mindset that kept the momentum going.
And he had to, there were a lot of things that he had to do to keep this research going, including just like in a normal medical setting. He had to administer research that was academic so that he could later on down the line administer research that was like psychedelic, you know?
Yeah, he had like a foot in two different worlds. He was a hustler.
So it's a good time to sort of contextualize what was going on in Pollock's practice at the time. Now, to work on introducing psychedelic administration in medical settings, Pollock kind of had to prove effects against an already documented problem. And he decided to begin with what is constantly a very poorly defined thing, autism. So Paul Stamets claims Pollock administered these research experiments on autistic patients whose parents were sort of at wit's end, didn't know what to do, didn't know how to handle it. And he also says that they had maybe not very sustainable but positive results.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, and given like the ultimate history of Pollock's medical practice, as we'll see, this is like a believable claim. He often conducted experiments and provided procedures
Right.
under the table.
Yeah. Michael Forbes, however, claims that this was sort of a fabricated claim as a means to get the DEA on board for further experimentation, not necessarily against a documented problem, but just for the sense of general self-betterment, not, trying to cure an affliction, just trying to better yourself as you are.
Yeah, and throughout his brief career, kind of being able to conduct his research and have the funding to develop psilocybin mushrooms within the realm of mainstream medicine was always a goal of Pollock's. So this would make sense.
Yeah, and so in 1979, he applies for a patent on Tamponensis sclerotia as a psychotherapeutic medicine. And he began traveling to South America often for research and ended up discovering 3 novel species in 1979: Psilocybe armandi, Psilocybe wassaniorum, and Psilocybe schultezi. And during these times, his social standing was very controversial. People were sort of out to get him. He would leave, he would come back, his house would have been robbed.
Yeah, I mean, he was exposing himself to like all kinds of people. They knew he was making a lot of cash,
right?
And so he was in a uniquely vulnerable position. So he, I think, eventually like got bars put on his window.
Yeah, but he refused to buy a gun. As we see, he preferred more natural methods like martial arts.
Yeah, Paul Stamets, who we've mentioned, and who you might know from the Netflix documentary Fantastic Fungi.
Yeah, he's kind of the mycologist.
He's the darling of the mushroom community,
of the mushroom kingdom,
and he's interesting. But he had sort of a relationship with Pollock that was often contentious, but he was going to teach him martial arts around this time, which we thought was a fun detail.
Sometimes you just have to defend your incredibly valuable property housing several rare species of mushrooms with the art of your own body.
Yeah, you have to protect the mycelial mass through not with weapons of mass destruction, but with tried and true ancient fighting practices. Alright, before we get any deeper into the mycelial lore of Stephen Pollock, we want to take a minute to talk about some of our own experiences, some of our own experiments that we've been doing in preparation for this episode. Personally, for me, that pretty much just involves macrodosing 500 milligrams, sometimes 1,000 milligrams of reishi mushroom, a reishi mushroom cacao powder, for vitality and
Yeah.
eagle eye focus.
Which is, yeah, we have to mention is completely retail
Yeah,
substance.
I-
It's just like stuff that you buy at HEB.
It's like a
Obviously,
box
reishi.
a box of like packets that I bought at HEB for like $23,
Yeah.
that I don't have. And this is all also contextualized. I bought this during a period of great anxiety and personal strife, and I convinced myself that reishi mushroom would change my life, and
I feel that it might.
it still might change. It's still
There's still time.
jury's out.
I have also been doing that. I've been drinking like mixing like a mushroom powder with my coffee. And I've also been taking like lion's mane capsules. And I feel like it generally has been feeling pretty good. I feel like when I take the little mushroom packet, I do focus better. But I didn't feel like that today, and I drank one. But then I realized that it's not because the product isn't working, it's because Camille put a lava lamp in our studio.
I've been working hard to spruce up the studio. I really wanted to kind of evoke a psychedelic vibe for the purpose of today's recording.
It's working.
And that includes putting a gorgeous lava lamp on our card table, and it's very distracting. But we have big plans for the studio in general. I want it to look like kind of like a hospital waiting room in a late 80s crime movie. I want to have like a fake ficus and a Rolodex and a green desk lamp.
Yeah, I want it to look like the movie set itself, like a craft services table with like beef jerky and Modelo micheladas.
Well, that's pretty much how
It is.
that's pretty much how it's looking. But I recently obtained a Black & Decker coffee pot, which has kind of been a revelation.
It's sitting on top of the file cabinet in our studio. It looks beautiful.
Yeah, I have a beige file cabinet that was really important to me for some reason to have in the space with all my files. And Faith got me a gorgeous, like depression glass colored refrigerator that fits several beverages. So things are coming together for us. An experiment I wish I did was I didn't have the chance to like get a severe wound or gash during the preparation process, and I wanted to see if like putting a slice of moldy bread on my open wound would like offer antibiotic properties like in the Civil War.
Yeah.
I didn't get to that. Nothing happened to me.
Well, we have time. Once we get the studio set up, it can be a functional hospital. Which is actually, can bring us back to our topic.
You went, yeah. Stephen Pollock did have to kind of convert his DIY business into more of a believable hospital space.
Yeah. So he was running a pharmacy out of his house. That's what he had to do. That's sort of the thing that he stooped to doing to gain funds for this super lab. He was writing prescriptions for Quaaludes, he had a lot of people who depended on him specifically to feed their addictions. And a lot of those drugs, too, were sort of going out of fashion in the medical field. But he would have people come, pay in cash. He would write them a script for Quaaludes. He would supply them.
And things started to get very ambiguous here. There's a story that he like prescribed Quaaludes to a woman who was passed out when she, pass through the threshold of his...
Had been brought in by a group of men.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he was also doing things like providing free healthcare for, low-income families and stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know. There was a very mixed bag of people and of afflictions in his house. He had politicians, regular old drug users.
Yeah, it was a really kind of like who's who of San Antonio. His business partner, Forbes, was quoted as saying that the office was indeed a who's who of San Antonio society. Drug use knows no socioeconomic boundaries, and so on a given day you would find scientists, government officials, and the most strung-out junkies all waiting in line for their turn.
Right, and we read that he would bring in $10,000 a day. He was also using his house as a place to just perform surgeries. Part of his sort of like underground medical service was not just writing prescriptions, but actually performing physical work on people. People would come in with gunshots, and
people who didn't want to take their injuries to a hospital because it would have legal implications.
Yeah. The hospital would have to call the police, or there would be some sort of pressing charges involved.
These people would go to Pollock, and he would play it cool. He wouldn't ask questions. He would fix them up. And all during this, he has this world famous business. He's raking in all this money. He's shipping things all over the world, and naturally that catches the eye of various organizations who have a problem with what he's doing. He's being watched by the DEA. He, at the same time, while he's running this practice and providing these mushroom kits, he also has a secret marijuana farm near the San Antonio International Airport, and apparently the DEA was flying planes over, kind of keeping tabs on everything.
Yeah. I think the factory was, the Hidden Creek factory was by the airport. And then the mushroom farm was right behind Twin Sisters.
And Twin Sisters is a diner.
Yeah.
In central San Antonio.
Yeah, he had a mushroom farm behind a quirked up diner called Twin Sisters, where all the Alamo Heights ladies go and have their egg salad.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of Beatles memorabilia on the walls, which is just a funny detail. But he's also being monitored by local law enforcement. There were a couple of undercover cops who visited him, and he prescribed them Dexedrine.
He began to sort of freak out. He's understanding that things are closing in on him. Obviously, the nature of his work is incredibly illegal. His medical practice is illegal and ethically ambiguous, and people are starting to notice, definitely. And not only have they noticed, they've caught him in the act. They are ready to, close down on him.
Yeah, but he's steadfast in his mission. He keeps going. He keeps writing scripts. Because he's completely oriented around this ultimate goal of breaking through.
Yeah.
Beyond their relevant hallucinogenic properties, mushrooms have a very important role in our ecosystem, of course. People have long been fearful of them due to their association with death and decay. Mushrooms functionally decompose, they rot, and return nutrients back into the soil. This feels like a fitting point to talk about the events that led to the death of Dr. Stephen Pollock.
So, January 31st, 1981. It's another workday for Pollock. Things are pretty much going as they normally would. He's taking patients. His secretary doesn't notice anything unusual. Eventually, his girlfriend Mitzi and him decide to have dinner together, and then she calls at 7.
Yeah, she calls at 7. They talk. Normal relational chatter.
When are you gonna marry me?
Baby, like, put a ring on it.
Not unless we have a prenup,
I love
babe.
you. He was like, babe. She on record said that he was like literally girls posting their L's like, babe, we can't get married until you sign a prenup. And that's basically their last conversation.
Yeah, and then at 9:30, Paul Stamets calls Pollock. They kind of, their friendship had grown distant, because Stamets was kind of growing weary of Pollock's methods, the way that he was working and drawing attention to himself, because Pollock was still in the game, absolutely. He was nonstop working, taking patients, and I mean, the constant in and out of his house, you know, drew lots of attention to him. The police were already on his ass, like, people knew what was going on, and Stamets didn't really want to be a part of that. But he comes across some information, a reference that Pollock might be able to use to help him get the patent for psilocybe tamponensis. So Stamets gives him a call. Pollock is being kind of weird on the phone. He's like,
yeah, we don't know if he's giving him the runaround to kind of like bust his balls, or if there's like an escalating situation.
Yeah,
on the other end of things.
He's like being interrupted by other calls. He seems kind of frantic. And eventually, you know, after a bunch of back and forth, multiple calls, Pollock says, I have to go. There's a car outside. Some patients just pulled up.
And yeah, Stamets is the last person who heard from Pollock officially. On record, Mitzi is said to have called Pollock a few times after he hadn't been home, to the point that she was expecting him. And growing concerned, she pulled up to his house, you know. No doubt, you know, concerned. And as she approaches the house, she sees his body prostrate on the floor through the window.
Yeah.
And initially she thinks that he had knocked himself out trying to light a burner, which he had apparently done a few months prior. And of course this still concerns her. So she like can't get into the house. It's all bolted up. She runs to a neighbor's house.
Which we should mention, she wrote that his house was usually unlocked.
Yeah, that's key. So she runs to a neighbor's, she gets some help, they get into the house, and quickly the reality of the situation starts to become very apparent.
Yes. Pollock has been shot, and he's inside, laying supine in a pool of blood.
His pockets there's a laceration on his face, his pockets are cut open, his house is ransacked, basically. And naturally, she's hysterical.
So, early 1981, Dr. Stephen Pollock is found dead. And we just want to posthumously set the scene for you a little bit. I actually found his house in real life. I went to this little suburban home that Pollock was doing all of this out of. And I mean, it's the sort of place where you imagine, especially in the 80s, you know, I would imagine that people sort of knew what was going on with each other. Like, especially with the constant ins and outs that Pollock was having, government officials.
Lines out his door.
Yeah, right. And like, I know also in his experiments, he would bring in like large piles of manure. People would ask him what he was doing, and he would maybe like jokingly respond, top secret government program, just to get them to stop asking questions, you know. So I went to this house. It was small, big enough, of course, for Pollock, for the things that he was doing. It looks pretty similar to the way that it looked in 70s, early 80s. And it's in a very tight neighborhood. So the amount of people that knew what was going on here was likely very large. When you consider the police presence, just the neighbors in general, their concerns about what was going on their street.
Yeah.
It's no secret. Like, what he was doing was shady and it was underground, but it wasn't by any means a secret. And it was strange. Like, everything seemed to point to Pollock at that point. And I will say that when I went to the house, I probably looked very strange and, like, shady. Driving through, like, the darkened streets. It was nighttime. I had a black and white photo from this article we're getting a lot of the information from held up in front of me. My phone was dim. I'm comparing it to every house I see, and eventually I find the one, and we sit in front of it, and there's, like, someone doing, like, late night yard work as I, like, take pictures of their household.
The you know, next generational remains of mushroom mass that he had planted, seeded into the earth, were getting chopped by lawnmowers' blades. Yeah, I imagine.
And it was strange, and I mean, it was also because I knew it was, like, a place imbued with very strange history that seems incredibly monumental, and it's weird that so few people, no one I've ever talked to in San Antonio knows about this, and it seems like such a totally major thing that happened here.
Huge.
But I will say that when I exited the neighborhood, on a storage unit pointing to the street, there was a little graffitied mushroom. And I thought it was so cute. And it felt like a very special, like, marker. Like, it was like a fly agaric mushroom pointing to Pollock Street. Like, has that been there for 43 years?
Yeah, it's just and you know, I mean, truly, yeah, I never knew about this before, and I've lived here most of my life, you know, and to most people who pass by now, it's just like an insignificant piece of graffiti, but
to me it was everything.
It points to this kind of glamorous, like, subtropical noir that has materialized through the life of Stephen Pollock.
Yeah, and the reason I wanted to go there and to tell you all about it was because it does sort of lend itself to just seeing what the situation was physically. Like, as I said, there was no way for him to keep all of this a secret. Like, he was doing all of it in plain sight, basically.
Well, and on such a large scale that it was, like, impossible to, like he was just, like, praying that, like, he could get, like, license before it caught up with him, I imagine.
And in several different areas around San Antonio, too. Big enough where, like, the force field of Pollock's influence covers a lot of different bases.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of theories about what might have happened in his death. Mitzi, actually his girlfriend at the time, was immediately questioned because apparently this girl,
yes, girlfriend,
while the police were in his house, she was like, actually, could I just sneak in there real quick? Let me sneak by I just need to get some of my utensils from his kitchen.
Which was bizarre. Your boyfriend gets shot dead, and
yeah, that's like an Amanda Knox style level of casual and logistical concern in the wake of a loved one's death.
Yeah,
very
God.
Strange of her.
She generally is not looked at as a prime suspect, but it is.
She's just looked at as, like, being a little bit weird,
just like a weird bitch. But there's a whole tapestry of other suspects. I mean, you know, this makes sense. Pollock was playing in rings that were with fighters on a global scale. He was fraternizing with people with different degrees of power and different degrees of what they were willing to do to get what they want within the Bexar County area. So you can imagine that the range of suspects is very vast and very hard to, and that's what makes this case so intriguing and so unknowable. But there are some common theories. One of the first suspects was local pimp named Archie Lee Johnson, who was known to cruise the streets of Pollock's neighborhood in his Cadillac Eldorado.
It was pink.
It was pink. And, you know, one of Pollock's secretaries is quoted as remembering that Johnson owed Pollock a great debt. And so that was cited as a possible motivation. But then Pollock's business partner, Forbes, said that, you know, a little bit before the murder of Pollock, he came to him with an idea that he was going to hire Johnson and pay him to take out a couple cops. And Forbes, you know, vehemently opposed this idea, and allegedly the plan fell through, and, you know, maybe Johnson would turn against Pollock and took the hit out on him. Another theory, and it gets a little bit strange and starts to open up the conspiratorial mind. Fingerprints were found on the scene that correlated to a trio of roommates who were frequent patients of Pollock's. Virgil Lissy, Ernest Dietzman, and Jerry Baker, and a fourth man, Arthur Lenz. And it was confirmed that Lissy was out of town in Austin on the night of the murder, but through his confessions and his admissions about the men that he cohabitated with, he claimed that they had been bragging about killing Pollock for some time. And, you know, he listed some other facts about them. They were infatuated with firearms. One of them was a former Vietnam vet. And they had talked about robbing Pollock for a while. And then after the act, talked about killing him in great detail. And there was a detective on the case, and the Bexar County District Attorney, Terry McDonald, according to the records, refused to prosecute them, even though there was an admission and evidence, and it was pretty damning. The author of kind of definitive account of the story of Pollock, Hamilton Morris, he filed an open records request with the Bexar County DA's office, kind of trying to see why the case wasn't prosecuted. And when he did this, they said that there were no files on Pollock, but that, like, there were possibly 4 records that have been destroyed. In this article, it was also discovered that Terry McDonald wasn't actually, you know, when confronted, he said that he wasn't actually the Bexar County District Attorney at the time. So the refusal to prosecute this case wasn't on his hands at all. And when Morris tried to get to the bottom of who was the attorney at the time, he couldn't find the records. And in the police records, the official police records, it says that Terry McDonald was the district attorney. So already we're starting to see some inconsistencies here.
Yeah, misaligned information.
There's also, you know, an idea, a conspiracy that Ross Perot had a desire for Pollock's head. He was rumored to say that he wanted to destroy him, and he was an obvious drug war vigilante. But I think there was it was untrue. Like, nobody could find evidence that he actually said that. But there are still other theories too.
Yeah, so a lot of this started because now Hamilton Morris is like a Vice guy, and he's a Nepo baby, of course. Errol Morris, his father, being the director of the Thin Blue Line.
Bizarre.
But so much of this started because Hamilton Morris was given a tape. He was given a tape by a psychology professor and gerbil aggression researcher, Gary Davis. And on the tape was a police officer, a Castle Hills, San Antonio police officer named Wayne Merchant, talking to someone who's described as the burglar. And they're talking about this Pollock case, and they're both sort of respectively lamenting that people have been accusing them of killing him. And the burglar, like, lets Wayne Merchant, the police officer, know that, you know, people think that he did it too. And they're talking about crime, obviously, you know, a couple people who are involved in, like, the seedy underbelly of San Antonio at the time. Wayne Merchant is clearly a crooked copper who's involved with these informants in a way that causes him to he talks about, like, wasting guys, you know.
Yeah, he's a dirty dog.
He's mobbed up, and he talks about, like, you know, I had a buddy that shot a bunch of people on Broadway one night. Stuff like that. So yeah, it connects them to the Pollock crime. It's
a sleazy story all around.
Yeah, and this, among many, many other things, makes you wonder, was this an inside job? You know, like, in the aftermath of Pollock's death, his father, who he was pretty much estranged from, his father wasn't really privy to what Pollock was doing. He comes down to San Antonio from Los Angeles. He was a Los Angeles real estate developer. And he basically just, like, squats in Pollock's home, and he's amazed. He had no idea that, you know, his son was working at this magnitude. And because he was, like, so, I don't know, struck by it, he tries to convince the cops to not destroy all of Pollock's work. And eventually the cops decide to do it anyway, of course.
Yeah.
And they found, like, a really extraordinary mushroom lab in Pollock's backyard.
I think it was dubbed, like, the biggest mushroom bust in history or something at that point.
Yeah, he just had, obviously Pollock was known for discovering species, so he had, like, several rare species. He was selectively breeding a bunch of things. He had, like, spore prints and just, like, an insane wealth of knowledge. And the DEA just burned it to the ground.
Yeah, they got rid of it completely. And, you know, strange detail, his father approached Pollock's business partner and was, like, proposing that they, like, move all of it to Haiti because he had, like, criminal connections there that might be able to, like, harbor this, like, vast array of, like, mushrooms. So it's an interesting detail about Pollock's father, and the world that he was living in.
And shortly before Pollock's death, too, it was looking like he was about to be arrested, be prosecuted, right?
Yeah.
And then the charges were dropped, and then very shortly after the charges were dropped, he's found dead.
Very curious.
Very curious.
So when you zoom out and look at all of these different things, particularly the fact that these records were seemingly scrubbed and nobody was prosecuted.
Also, in Pollock's house after his death, you know, we mentioned that it had been ransacked, and one of the things that whoever was involved did was they sort of sorted through the records and displayed them in the way that hid maybe more important patients.
Yeah, so it's hard. So what conclusions can you draw from this? I mean, it seems clear that officials of some kind wanted him dead.
I mean, everything that he had was so valuable, and there's a dense governmental history that would lead you to believe that the possession of powerful psychedelics would benefit them greatly, and that a Planet K coded doctor with access to all of these that was looking to administer them in some sort of medicinal way for self-betterment was not doing exactly what maybe they wanted with these psychedelics.
And also just the timeline of how quickly he, you know, kind of gained this, like, prominence and, like, access to the global community, and, like, like how many people he was influencing and empowering to, like, experiment with this stuff on their own.
I mean, the whole story that we're talking about takes place over like a 3-year period.
It's crazy.
Yeah, so he quickly rose to fame and then immediately fell from grace very quickly. And in a way that left no real room for speculation because everything was destroyed.
Yeah. Paul Stamets thinks the cops killed him.
Yeah. There's a point early on in this article by Hamilton Morris where he approaches Paul Stamets at a talk that Stamets is giving, and he like tells him about the tape, and Paul Stamets is like, "Oh, Stephen Pollock, he was murdered by the police." And it's in the middle of other people being like, "Paul Stamets, what mushroom should I eat if I want to have beautiful, luscious hair?" and stuff like that. And, like,
Yeah. On a cold day on Tuesday, February 3rd, funeral services were held for Pollock, and this introduces another character into the mix. His name was Sam Green, who later went by Father Benedict, and we could honestly do an entire other episode on this, and we probably will. But he was kind of like a shifty local like radio personality and real estate pitchman, who kind of started this like Orthodox monastery that later got taken down for being like connected to like all manner of pedophilic stuff like that. It was not a good thing, but I guess Pollock, given his position in town, is like kind of being no questions asked, connected to everybody.
Right.
You can understand maybe why he would be buried you can understand why funeral services would be held at a monastery like that, Castle of the Hills Church. But that's as I've said, a tale for another day. If you're a local, you might have seen Green dress as groovy Granny Green in some of his advertising. But again, a tale for another day. I just think it's interesting. And when Pollock was buried, he was buried with a mushroom in each hand. One was on his left hand was a large P. cubensis strain that he had found in Oaxaca. And Hidden Creek had sold this, and in his right hand it was a different P. cubensis strain that he had discovered at the Plantersville Renaissance Festival in Texas, which is kind of awesome. I mean, God, what a fitting way for the man to be buried.
Yeah.
With the decomposers of his own finding.
A band called the Supernatural Family Band played at his funeral.
A honky tonk band.
Right.
It's truly cinematic. And there's so many threads. It's hard to go in depth with all of them.
I visited his grave. I was like on the way to something and didn't have a lot of time. And I was like, I'll just make a quick stop. So I went to, it's called, I think Mission City Burial.
Mission City Cemetery. Yeah.
And we stopped there. Me and Zoid, who you all met at the Orb episode.
Give it up for Zoid.
And he was very pragmatic about the approach. He went to the office to ask where Pollock was buried. I found the coordinates on the website, so I just decided, or the website being his Wikipedia page. So I just decided to like try my best to wander through all of the very closely placed together graves to find him. And it's a very large cemetery. It was in like the back right corner. And I found it. Was there any fungal matter sprouting around the grounds? No, and it wasn't even really, let me pull up my picture, but it wasn't like, there was nothing on his grave site to imply that he lived, the life that he did. It just said Dr. Stephen Hayden Pollock in God's care.
Don't people like? Do you know how like people call Blaze Foley the duct tape messiah, and they like leave duct tape
Right.
on his grave? We should go to Stephen Pollock's grave and like spread spores or something, and like create like a beautiful mycelial like
Yeah.
bouquet or something.
Well, maybe I guess I don't know how mushrooms work, but because, well, no, never mind. I was going to say because he was buried with mushrooms, maybe there's a beautiful
Well, I'm sure, I mean, everywhere silently
yeah.
underfoot as we tread this earth, as we move through Bear County, partially thanks to Pollock, there's
a dense network.
a dense network of mycelial threads just dominating, things that our eyes can't even see. The mushrooms that sprout are just like the reproductive
right
organs, but I think we should barter with the mission groundskeeper, give him something that makes a deal to neglect his duties worthwhile, so we can
see what sprouts,
so we can see what sprouts, so we can pay homage to Pollock.
Yeah,
I think
that's what
I didn't go there.
Cool. So there's a lot that we could say about his death and about the conspiracy. Honestly, given the way that the evidence was destroyed, the way that things played out, I feel like certain, in my mind, of course, that, the government, the DEA had something to do with it. They knew something leading up to it. What that is, it's hard to say. And I don't really know. I feel like a lot of the people who listen to this podcast are similarly minded, that they might think, it seems obvious in the aftermath of his death and the way that things were sort of misrepresented, the way that things were just totally destroyed, that, there's much more than meets the eye. And the fact that no one was ever prosecuted despite all of this different evidence in several different directions.
All these goons who were offering themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly strange.
And maybe they were hired hands and, but...
Yeah, so
given certain incentive, who knows?
Right. I feel like it's better to just sort of present all of this information and just say, this is obviously symptomatic of a much larger thing, and you can sort of draw your own conclusions. We certainly have. But I do think it's important to sort of contextualize what Pollock was doing, the idea of psychedelics in a medicinal context, and maybe some of our feelings about it.
Right.
So let me see it. There's a specific quote that I wanted to read. So yeah, there was a point in, and we should also note that there is very little out there about Pollock, and I think that's by nature of so much evidence being destroyed. It's sort of a cagey story. The Hamilton Morris article is really all there is. It's the most definitive thing that's been written about Pollock. And so there's a quote that he has in his article that says, "Those hoping to introduce psychedelics into the pharmacopoeia of allopathic medicine, and there have been several, have always encountered a problem. They simply don't fit into a medical paradigm where the betterment of already well people is not considered a valid pursuit," right? Mm-hmm. And that's sort of what we talked about with Pollock experimenting on those with autism, is that he had to provide some sort of evidence against an already documented case in order to conduct these experiments on people who maybe didn't have any sort of neurological or physical problems. They just wanted to take some sort of psychotherapeutic approach to better themselves as people. And my question, maybe like a little bit of pushback against this quote from the Morris article, is it, the medical paradigm against treating already well people, or is it the long-standing experimental traditions that prove the great harm psychedelics can cause in clinician-guided settings, or, government involvement in the administering of psychedelics? And would enough American citizens actually trust a sanctioned approach to psychedelics given the history of governmental psychedelic programs? And, do American citizens actually care about any of that enough or know about it enough in swaths large enough to influence an acceptance of psychedelic medical practice? Is it maybe just reduced to the idea that drugs are generally bad? Yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting, and there are a lot of questions that can be drawn. I messaged my good friend Abby, who works in a hospital, and I kind of asked her just like, what is the attitude about this now? Like, do you know anything about it? Have you experienced anyone trying to push for this in the setting that you're working in? And she sent me an article from the Harvard Divinity Bulletin, and sort of said that she's skeptical of use in psychedelics because she doesn't think that the clinicians that would be administering these sorts of things are really ready to recognize the actual problems with it, or like what it means to have a bad trip or something like that. So the article she sent me is by a person named Rachel Peterson, and it's basically about how she was a part of an experimental study where she was undergoing psychedelic treatment and how she had effectively a bad trip. But she also talks about how we need to move away from the language of good or bad trips, and we need to move towards a framework that looks at it as something more phenomenological. We need to explain what happened rather than trying to explain the value of what happened. And I found this really interesting because I think that, when we're talking about Stephen Pollock and the things that he wanted to do, there's sort of like a teleological approach to psychedelics where we're thinking about it because the idea is that you will have some sort of psychedelic experience and you'll feel totally chilled out and connected, and it'll make you a better person in some way. But what does that mean when we take the end all of this experience as something that was sort of maybe like, you're being put in a divine mindset and you're being connected to things? What does that mean when the things that you're being connected to end up being very bad?
In that case, like, and this is posed in the article, like, instead of framing it like, well, if you didn't have a good trip, then that means it wasn't successful. Like,
it's like a user error.
Yeah, like having a quote bad trip is like still like you should be examining that like phenomenologically and like evaluating like, well, what was experienced, how did that impact you in like a way that like it is like severed from like valence of like good or bad.
Yeah, and she mentions Husserl in this article too, and something that Husserl writes about is that representations like hallucinations are sort of characterized as being a representation of an intentional object, and that you see all of that through a framework that's made under an existential assumption. So again, it's like it kind of comes back to user error. And then something that Merleau-Ponty wrote too is all hallucination bears initially on one's own body. So they're writing about these things, not about psychedelics necessarily, but about hallucinations and the phenomenology of them and how, they come from the body first, right? And so that's sort of the idea, is that, if you're doing this sort of thing in a clinician-guided setting and you have a so-called bad trip, then it's maybe a problem with the setting itself, or you weren't in the right mindset. But really, it's like, it's the experience altogether, and there's no way to actually manipulate that into being good.
Yeah.
But if we're thinking about it from like a teleological perspective, then if the trip is bad, then we should be able to reckon with that in a way that makes some sort of sense from the badness. And that's what the article talks about, is just like maybe, trying to thin the veil between our world and whatever we're accessing when we take psychedelics or use them as some sort of medicinal property. Then we should be willing to accept that sometimes getting closer to that sort of thing will not make us feel good. and that's something that's been accepted, but oftentimes the way that is accepted is, you know, in underground therapeutic settings where they are showing patients like videos of war and pornography and stuff like that to try to induce a horrible trip.
Yeah.
For some sort of like cathartic reason to get all of that, like just purge the badness from your soul. And what does that do? What are you supposed to come away with? You know, I don't know.
Yeah, like maybe suffering doesn't necessarily, you know, it's not for an ultimate like end of good. Like,
yeah, it's not like virtuous to suffer by nature. It's just something that you kind of do sometimes. I don't know, but she talked too about like the push for this now, and the language that surrounds psychedelics and how they used to be called like hallucinogens, you know, inducing hallucinations, or psychotomimetic, stimulating a state of psychosis, and now they're being called, you know, just like psychedelics, or like invoking the psyche, or entheogens, generating some sort of religious or godlike state in you. And there's, of course, like a very dense context where all of that comes from.
Yeah, like entheogens, that's what was like in like the cave of like the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi, right?
Yeah.
Like things that, you know, there's a dense history of like, you know, psychedelics inducing like godly or religious states.
Yeah, there's a whole sect of people referencing specifically the Sacred Mushroom of the Cross by Allegro.
Yeah.
He talks about like the Plain Curalt Chapel and the fresco there, and there are different
which is like the Garden of Eden presented, or like Adam and Eve, and then depicted in the middle is like a tree with like what appears to be like mushrooms, like
the
sprouting
tree of
out.
Knowledge and good and evil. There are several depictions of that throughout art history where mycologists, maybe of the more, you know, hippie type, interested more in maybe the plain water psychedelic notions of things and not the research, have suggested that perhaps what's being presented to us is a large mushroom or something, you know, like that Christianity has been founded on ancient fertility cults, and
that Jesus is maybe like not a historical figure, but a hallucination of early Christians who
Jesus is a mushroom.
Jesus is a mushroom, and they consumed mushrooms,
his
and
flesh and body, which is just, you know,
mycelial mass or something. And there's you know, and he talks about like what's that specific toadstool called?
Fly agaric, the red and white one, little cartoon mushroom.
Amansis or something. And there's like in this realm, there's also theories about like Santa Claus being like a Siberian shaman, and how his like you know traditional red and white outfit mimics this like psychedelic toadstool, and there's like all sorts of threads that connect back, that kind of relate to these like fertility cults.
It's just it's an interesting like area of study to me, because it's trying to manipulate a situation where you can kind of control yourself enough to you're like giving yourself a sense of control that puts you in a state to completely surrender, and it's like sort of a contrived thing that I don't know. He talks about like the betterment of people who are already well, and that's just interesting to me because it's so totally possible that people who are already well don't need this. Like, getting closer to something
might like actually cause a mental breakdown,
or
like a complete dissolving of like being able to like exist on like a reality that feels functional.
Yeah, she mentioned like Sartre too, and I think 1935
taking mescaline
and seeing the crabs, which when I was young I read Nausea, and the part about him seeing the crabs on the beach really stuck with me. apparently I knew that, but I didn't know that he had to consult Lacan afterwards.
I know.
To do some psychoanalysis on him. And then Aldous Huxley and, The Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell and stuff, mescaline hallucinations have led to great anxiety and anger and confusion and like breakthroughs, but it's like, okay, breaking through to what? And what are you?
Do we know what we're dealing with here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like something that's, I mean, literally the mycelial mass is much larger than us, and its effects are things that we can't really comprehend yet. So to put those into a medicinal setting or into a setting where everything is so delicate is hard to imagine. But then at the same time, the pharmaceutical industry in general is like, I've known so many people who have like destroyed their lives or had horrible reactions to like birth control or like Lexapro or something like that,
Yeah, when it does become within this like common like, FDA approved like medicinal realm, like you also have to consider that like the bottom line isn't like your well-being necessarily, or like any like spiritual like reconciliation. It's like the like purchase and like sale of the drug.
Yeah, and I mean those drugs are meant to make you, a more productive member of society, which I guess in Pollock's view, psilocybin mushrooms maybe would too. It's just that like, you're not, when you start like Lexapro or something, you're probably not reminiscing on like kaleidoscopic visions of the trees, or like the web of love that I don't know.
No, it's true. It's like literally a different animal.
Yeah, definitely.
So as we kind of wrap up, I just want to say that, the article we were just talking about discusses having sort of a value neutral assessment to mystical experiences, right? Which is something that I think in general is very relevant to all of the things that we examine on the podcast. A lot of the subjects we focus on, as we've discussed in the past, contain a great deal of ambiguity. Obviously, Forrest Bess, the woman who fell in love with the orb, and all of these things, and I think in the case of Pollock too, and the topic of hallucinogens, there's a vagueness between realms of good and evil, of sanity and insanity, of the divine and delusion. And it's interesting to examine these things because we often encounter these spaces as we go through life, if on smaller scales, but also as we choose how to approach psychedelics ourselves, and kind of interact with like these otherworldly kind of ideas. In psychedelics, they have an equal history with violence as they do with sort of like hippy dippy harmony. The Maya, who in the archaeological record have mushroom stones and allusions to mushrooms, mushroom use during human sacrifices in several codices. And this violence is also, culturally relative, and there's an ambiguity there. You can't really say if it's good or bad. And Pollock, sort of had this value neutral attitude towards the law. He is a morally ambiguous character, but I think just like allowing kind of his story to exist like phenomenologically and like just like evaluating like just like the arc of his life and his career is still interesting.
I think learning about his story was very interesting to me because, as we talked about earlier, it seems like such a huge thing that happened. I mean, like right under our noses. Obviously, we weren't around for it as it was happening, but it's just strange that it's not a more codified part of San Antonio history because, I mean, everything that he did was incredibly prescient. Like, he was fighting for things that people are still fighting for today, people are still pushing back against today. And I don't know, like, the things that he was researching, too, like, using brown rice as a growth substrate. I was talking to someone about all of this, and he told me that he goes on a subreddit called like Uncle Ben's or something, which is where people talk about growing mushrooms and Uncle Ben's brown rice. It's just funny. Like it's strange to me that no one knows about this. When I was at Central Market earlier today, I was buying the like mushroom coffee packets, and I went to our Central Market has like a beautiful mushroom cave where they grow mushrooms themselves.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Yeah, it's so strange. And there was like it's the legendary Taste of Texas week at Central Market HEB, which means that a bunch of farms from around the state have sent people to represent them and like cook their food on site basically. And so there was this like cute young girl cooking mushrooms, and I approached her. I was like, okay, I want to talk to her about mushrooms. And I approached her and I was like, so you cooking mushrooms? And she was like, yeah. And
yes, girl.
I was like, oh, that's cool. I've actually been reading a lot about mushrooms recently.
God, Faith. Jesus Christ.
And I asked her if she knew who Stephen Pollock was, because she was like from the area, and she was like, I don't know, that sounds familiar. And I was like, well, he was killed by the police, and like immediately started talking about
and
his
she's
murder.
Like walkie-talking.
She's like at work
managers like there's a girl dressed in black like saying all these harsh things.
Yeah,
as I'm trying to peddle mushroom. No, that's funny.
But she sounded interesting. It was just like she was also at work. But I was just like trying to put feelers out of, someone who clearly knows a lot about mushroom cultivation, works in the industry of cultivation. I was like just trying to see if they knew that it had such a local history, and it was interesting to me that this is not like a story. And I think it's because like it is something for the city maybe that it feels shameful, because it's like, stories revolving around drugs are kind of sordid and like morally ambiguous, and
there's cover-ups and
right, and it makes the police look very bad, the way that like Wayne Merchant from Castle Hills PD was talking, the way that maybe the DEA, the implications about the way that they acted towards Pollock,
and where those records went. No, it's understandable why this wouldn't be there wouldn't be like a bronze statue like in front of like the Alamo or something,
right?
Or like a kind
Our
of like
fallen soldiers,
a mushroom topiary, framing the banisters at the Riverwalk. I also was trying to like gauge like knowledge of Pollock. I like maybe like a year or so ago, maybe longer, had kind of spoken to a representative from the Central Texas Mycological Society for like a work thing. And he was kind of like a really nice guy, very into mycology, and his name is Sam the Fungi, and he does like educational outreach and also does like mushroom walks between like San Antonio and Austin. And I went on one actually at the Almost Basin, where Whitley Strieber.
Wow,
I know, it's crazy how all of these things connect. And he was like showing us like all these different mushrooms that were growing in plain sight, accessing a mycelial mass underneath the kind of dirty soil that influence, who knows, maybe like somehow affecting all of the other events that went on there with Whitley Strieber. Who knows? But he was showing us all of these different mushrooms, and he's like, yeah, I wouldn't eat any of these. This is like a floodplain, like you're gonna get poisoned. Which was funny. But I reached out to him and asked him if he knew about Stephen Pollock, and he had heard of him, and was like, he said he was actually like a reason why he got super into mycology.
Oh, wow. Cool.
But didn't have a lot else to say other than like, he felt that the his like lawless pharmacology business, like maybe it was his downfall, because there aren't a lot of resources on him, and he knew. And then I reached out to another woman that was involved in the organization, Angel, and she hadn't heard of him, but was like really interested to learn more. we tried to get connected to some old heads who might have been around them, but that was a little bit unsuccessful.
Yeah.
But I asked the older woman who's teaching me to meditate. Yeah, maybe I'm trying to change my life, and maybe after reading the Harvard article, I am now terrified of meditating because I now see it as not an exclusively positive thing, but something that could
keep the veil between worlds very thick.
Yeah, I need to
opaque.
thicken the membrane between my worlds, actually, and that'll actually cure my anxiety. In addition to the 10,000 milligrams of reishi that I'm consuming. And I asked her about it, and she's like in her 70s, and she was like teaching TM in San Antonio around then. She said she had heard the name, but like didn't really know. I mean, who knows when people ask me if I know someone, I'm like, yeah, that sounds familiar. Who's to say? But yeah, there is such little public acknowledgement, even amongst people who you think would know.
Yeah.
Definitely. Do you have any other thoughts?
I guess not. I think that this has made me think more about like just the place of all of this in people's lives, and like, I don't know, like the self-care industry and the way that drugs, aside from like pharmaceutical drugs, have sort of made their way into that, and how the idea of like addiction in some senses have been replaced with like therapy, but not in a way that's necessarily good. Like, people are addicted to being therapized, whether it be like from some sort of physical substance, and that's like seen as, I don't know, it's like accepted in some ways, like and it all feels like a ploy for like consumerism and just encouraging people to buy more things, because if they buy more things, then they'll feel better about themselves or something.
Just back to the question of like, what does it mean for something, like looking at things through the lens of like, well, does it work or doesn't it work, and like evaluating like therapy and like pharmaceuticals to like a certain end, while also not acknowledging the wide range of like other impacts that it might have, and like how it should, maybe that shouldn't necessarily be the package be all end all of like solution to like your problems or lack thereof or something.
Yeah, definitely.
It definitely makes me think twice about like endeavoring crossing any of these lines, having psychedelic experiences.
Yeah, and a lot of this information that we've just laid out to you all is not anything that we can obviously like solve or make any commentary on, other than just us telling you, that this happened, and it's like a small thing that happened amongst a larger like rapidly growing social context surrounding drugs, and the way that they're treated, and the way that they're utilized in medical contexts and stuff like that. It's just something that you kind of have to take in at face value, and understand that like even at face value there are so many strange threads and incredibly like devious things that go on in plain sight in the medical community, the pharmacological community. It's just really strange. It's all just so strange. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but also just like, God, what a story. Not to be like the magic of the movies or something, but like the story of Stephen Pollock is so fascinating, because it's like you don't, at least I don't often hear tales like that told in San Antonio. I mean,
Yeah, and it all happened so fast.
It happened so fast, and that's probably why he was taken down in the end.
Right.
Yeah, this is... It's fascinating. Yeah.
I think that's I think
It's about
that's
time.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
Thank you all for joining us on this beautiful trip. We hope that you experienced a phenomenological administering of the psychedelic story, and I hope that you, I don't know.
Listen to some psych rock.
Yeah, listen to Plantasia.
Yeah, maybe like eat some like shiitake, like ravioli or something tonight.
Yeah. That sounds nice.
Make a risotto. Wander the suburban streets. Look behind dumpsters at your local gas station and see what kind of mycelium, what kind of mushrooms you encounter. See how they make you feel.
Might just save your life.
Or they might be the final thing that
destroys you.
Just destroys you.
Okay, well, yeah, this has been another beautiful episode of Texas Overture.
Yeah, let us know what you think. Let us know if you've had any experiences that relate. I'm Camille.
I'm Faith.
Thanks for listening, folks.
See you all soon.
Bye.
Bye. So